What if I told you that a single lost war document could change the way you see the world today? What would you do if you found a secret file, hidden for over 40 years, marked with a confidential seal, and that should never be opened? This is not a theory. This is not a fiction. I am talking about a lost Cold War file I discovered, and inside it, a document that made me in shock. For decades, we believed that military reports, interrogation transcripts, and official memorandum were only part of the bureaucracy of a time of tension between powers. But what if I tell you that behind these yellow pages was something much darker, something that does not appear in history books, but has been carefully kept so that no one ever had access? What I found was not just strategic information or records of military operations. It was a warning. A series of notes that mixed technical data with disturbing descriptions. Exact coordinates, names of black ink, scratched agents, forbidden's file. Stamps and fragments that seemed more confessions than reports. As I turned each page, the feeling was to be observed. As if those words, written in the peak of the Cold War, still carry a living weight, a warning addressed to those who dare read them. The document spoke of radio voices, transmissions that should never exist, protocols that made no sense to any known military manual. And it was at this point that I realized that was not just a historical record. It was a puzzle, a hidden code, left to anyone who had the courage to decipher. And the most disturbing thing is that the last sentence was not complete, as if it had been interrupted just as something happened. If you got here, I need you to do something. Tell me in the comments what you think was really behind this document. Do you believe it was just a bureaucratic error of the Cold War, or that there is something much deeper, carefully hidden from us? Your opinion may be the key to understanding how far this lost file connects with other secret reports. Each comment, each theory, helps keep this mystery alive and make more people have access to these forbidden files that were intended for oblivion. And if this type of content makes sense to you, don't forget to leave your like. This shows that you value the search for hidden truth and give us strength to continue bringing materials they should never have seen daylight. Subscribe to the channel and enable notifications, because this is just the beginning. There are still sealed pastes, burnt ribbons, and censored reports waiting to be revealed. And I promise, some of them are even more disturbing than this. Are you ready to open the next file? When that last interrupted sentence appeared before my eyes, I felt a shiver that was not just the cold temperature of the warehouse where the file had been found. It was as if those incomplete words were looking at me back, as if silence after them were heavier than anything I had ever read in military reports or confidential documents. I was facing something that should not have been preserved, something that may have survived by an accident, escaping censorship or intentional destruction. The file was part of a larger set, but strangely this specific dossier seemed isolated from the others. While other documents were organized by dates, operating codes, and military units, it was almost clandestinely fitted, clearly numbered, as if it had been stuck there in the last second, just to disappear, among hundreds of yellowish paper boxes. The first page featured a stamp that was not repeated in any other report. Ghost Voice Operation, Level 5 Classification. I had never seen this designation in any Cold War materials, and that, by itself, was already a sign that the content would be disturbing. At the top, it was read, Date, October 1962. Location, Ken Interrain Base, Eastern Europe. The time was not any time. October 1962 was precisely the month of the missile crisis in Cuba, the most tense moment of the entire Cold War. While the world feared a nuclear war, someone somewhere in Europe recorded a phenomenon that had nothing to do with missiles or bombs, but it seemed even more inexplicable. The first lines described something banal: radio communications maintenance, transmitter checking, routine inspection. Nothing that called attention immediately. But at the bottom, someone had written by hand with shaking letters, Don't answer the first call. Always wait for the second beat. This phrase looked like a protocol, but it was not in any direction known military IZ. Flipping the document, I began to realize that the report quickly turned from a technical record to something that seemed more like a survival diary. There were descriptions of voices that appeared in radio broadcasts, even when the devices were turned off from the power grid. Soldiers reported hearing orders, even by officers who were miles away, and sometimes even orders never officially registered. Some claimed to have heard their own voices, as if an echo coming from the future was calling them. One passage said, "At 2:13 a.m., we heard 3 beats on the metal. The operator answered immediately. He didn't come back." There were no more details. Just that brutal dry sentence and a blank space below, as if the description had been torn on purpose. The climate around this document made me question, would this have been a kind of psychological experiment, an extreme isolation test, like so many others secretly conducted during the Cold War? Or would it be something even darker, something that escaped the scientific explanation and plunged into the territory of what should never be registered on paper? The most disturbing was the amount of censorship cuts. Several pages had whole blocks covered by black stripes, and at some points, not even that. There were blank gaps, simply absent whole paragraphs, as if time had swallowed the truth. And every absence seemed to scream, louder than what had been left. On the left bank of one of the pages, I found something that was not an official stamp, but an annotation made in a hurry, almost scribbled. "If you hear your mother calling, not answering, it's not her." The impact of this sentence was immediate. It was not a soldier language. It was not a technical report. It was a personal, desperate warning, written by someone who knew it might not have a second chance to warn others. It was at this point that I began to realize that this file was not just a record of military communications, but a set of prohibited rules, fragmented survival instructions. As if a group of soldiers had discovered something that authorities would never officially recognize. As he advanced, he also realized the presence of proper names, but always followed by risks, censorship, or incomplete initials. Agent Nada, Captain Times Kenaz. These gaps reinforced the idea that identities needed to be erased, as if any personal connection with those events were too dangerous. A part described what they called the delayed listening protocol. The instruction was clear. If a familiar voice called for its name through the radio, it was necessary to wait exactly 3 seconds before answering. Replying immediately meant disappearing. There was no technical explanation, no scientific justification, only reports that those who responded without delay were ever seen. The most chilling detail appeared on a partially burned page. There was a diagram, poorly designed, showing something that looked like a sequence of sound waves. Below is an incomplete phrase. The voice is never the first. Never meet the end. And then the page ended in ashes, as if it had been burned from the inside out. I felt that each page dived deeper into a dead-end maze where the common rules of logic no longer worked. It was as if that file was not made to be read in full. Perhaps that was the reason for being hidden, isolated, as a piece that did not fit into any other Cold War dossier. And what tormented me most was the feeling that there was a clear intention behind the preservation of that document. He was not there by accident. Someone wanted it to be found in the future, like a message left over time. But why? To alert? To test? To attract who dared to open the box? It was then that I noticed an almost invisible mark on the back cover of the file. With a sloping light, I noticed letters recorded in low relief. Dossier 47B reading only. Aloud. That made no sense. Why would a document be instruction to be read aloud, not just analyzed silently? What would happen by giving voice to those words? I was alone, but I confess that I hesitated. Part of me wanted to close that folder immediately, return it to the darkness where it had remained for decades. But another part, dominated by curiosity, knew I couldn't stop, because if there was a hidden truth on those pages, it needed to be exposed. I took a deep breath, leaned against the document on the table, and started reading the first line aloud. If the voice is yours, wait for the second call. The instant I finished the sentence, a dry crack echoed in the room. The fluorescent lamps blinked, and a tinnitus took over the environment, such as electrical interference. The sound was low, but of course, and came from the opposite direction to the radio off. It was impossible. There was no source of energy connected. There was no active transmission, and yet the noise seemed to whisper something. I didn't understand immediately, but the syllables sounded frighteningly familiar. At that moment, I realized that opening that document was not just an act of reading. It was a ritual, a key, a protocol that activated something invisible but real, and what was dormant now seemed awake. The noise persisted for a few seconds, and my mind desperately sought a rational explanation. Residual interference, perhaps. An electromagnetic discharge caused by the old deposit cabling. But, as I approached the radio, I realized that it was not a common squeak. It was cadenced, almost as if there was an intention behind those invisible waves. So something impossible happened. Between the cracks and the metallic sound, a word formed clearly, dragged like a whisper from another room. The word was my name. I was paralyzed. It was not any voice. It was not an anonymous tone. It was my own voice. I recorded every detail as if the thin air of the environment had recorded the shock of that moment on my skin. The echo seemed to reproduce something I had not yet said, as if it came from the near future. And at that moment, I remembered the warning written in the document. If the voice is yours, wait for the second call. My eyes returned to the pages. It was not coincidence. It was as if the text was anticipating every step of my experience, as if the file was not only historical, but interactive, alive, feeding on the attention of those who read it. An uncomfortable feeling took me all the way. Did others before me pass the same sequence, so they left those desperate notes on the banks of the pages? The radio remained silent for a few seconds, but the atmosphere around me seemed heavier. The cold air, previously stopped, now had density, as if I bred something dense, invisible, loaded with electricity. And then came the second call. 3 dry beats on the metal of the shelf behind me. It was not possible to confuse. There was no one there, but the sound echoed tightly, vibrating in the roll boxes around. My body reacted before reason. I backed down 2 steps, my heart fired, hands shaking. But at the same time, a part of me knew that the protocol required to wait exactly for the second call. I had fully fulfilled the rule, and it saved me from responding to the first demonstration. But what would happen now that the second had sounded? I returned to the document. The following lines were partially blurred, but I managed to decipher. If you answer after the second call, describe what you saw. If you don't answer, you just register the silence. The logic was cruel. They knew something would appear. The soldiers who had participated in this record had lived the same phenomenon, and this instruction was a guide not to get lost in chaos. I swallowed dry and remained immovable, waiting. The shelf ranged, as if the weight of something invisible had leaned on it. And then a shadow projected on the wall, but there was no body to create it. A displeasure shape, as if it were my own distorted silhouette, elongated at impossible angles. The figure seemed to imitate me, but with a 2-second delay. When I raised my hand, the shadow only lifted it later. This lag, this time interval, was the essence of the phenomenon described in the document. They called human echo. It was not just voice. It was a reflection. It was a presence, an incomplete duplication that moved out of sync. I felt I shouldn't keep looking, but I couldn't look away. That's when the shadow opened his mouth. No sound came out, but I knew the next step would be the reproduction of my own voice, repeating phrases that I had not even pronounced. The document warned about this. The duplicate tries to predict your speech. Never confirm, never repeat. And at that moment, I understood the terror behind those pages. It was not just a military experience. It was a meeting with something that tested the limits of identity, as if a temporal slit had opened into. The Cold War entrapped echoes of soldiers, commands of commands, fragments of consciences that wandered until they found a victim to anchor. I closed the document for a few seconds, took a deep breath, and tried to rationalize. Perhaps it was a psychological suggestion, induced by intense reading and the atmosphere of isolation. But the metal beat still reverberated, and the shadow was still moving, late, over the wall before me. I took the pages again and searched for additional instructions. Between black stripes and censorship gaps, I found an almost unreadable paragraph. Never read the complete sequence aloud. The risk is of total duplication. This explained why the warning on the back cover. The document had been designed not to inform, but to test. It was like a trap. The simple act of reading was enough to activate the experience. I continued to advance against all the logic of self-preservation. I needed to know how far it was, because I felt that this material was connected to something much bigger. It couldn't just be a macabre curiosity of the Cold War. Perhaps they were part of a network of secret experiments, led in various parts of the world, with results buried under the dust of the military bureaucracy. Every technical detail reinforced authenticity. There were records of coordinates, exact times, climatic conditions noted in a report style. This gave credibility, but it also expanded terror, because it didn't seem like an invented tale, but an onboard diary of those who really lived it. As I read, I realized that the tone of the reports changed. In the first pages, soldiers wrote objectively, as if they were fulfilling orders. But as they advanced, the descriptions became emotional, full of despair, almost supplications for those who found those notes in the future. One passage said, "Don't look in the mirror after midnight. No matter what you hear, don't look." This warning seemed displaced from the military context, but within the document made sense. Several times there were mention of reflections that moved out of sync, voices that came across the glass, as if the radio were just an intermediary of something larger, a phenomenon that used surfaces to manifest. The following pages were stained with moisture, and one of them had a peculiar mark. It seemed the impression of a soaked hand, but it was larger than a common human hand, the fingers too long, as if the brand had been left by something not totally human. "Below is a lone phrase," he responded to his own voice. "We have never seen his body again." I felt the spine freeze. It was increasingly clear that this document was not just registered communications, but disappearances. The soldiers who failed to follow the rules were simply erased from existence. There were no bodies, there were no burials, only silence, as if they had been swallowed by the shadow itself. I closed my eyes for a few seconds, trying to recover my breath, and wondered, how many more of these files exist? How many other records were hidden under the pretext of military operations, when they actually documented inexplicable phenomena? If this was just a lost dossier of the Cold War, how many others remain locked, waiting to be discovered? The answer may be in other boxes, in other reports. But before I could get away from that specific document, I realized a detail that had already escaped me until then. In the lower right corner of the last page was a discrete arrow, indicating that the file was still in another volume. And next to the arrow, 3 scratched but still readable words. "You already answered. You already answered." These words scratched on the edge of the page hit me as an inevitable sentence. I had not pronounced any answer, but what if the simple act of reading aloud had already been interpreted as a form of interaction? What if the protocol were more complex than it seemed? Suddenly, I realized that perhaps I had crossed an invisible line, a barrier, that the soldiers tried to map, but could never completely describe. Silence in the room was no longer a common silence. It was a dense emptiness, almost audible, as if even the air had stopped moving. My eyes returned to the document, seeking some hidden instruction, but what I found was even more disturbing. On the following pages, there was a list of names, each accompanied by a single word, absent. There were no details about causes of death, No medical reports. Nothing that could be considered a rational justification. Only names and the mark of absence, as if those people had simply evaporated from reality. Later, a partial transcription revealed the testimony of one of the survivors. The voice was described as hesitant, trembled, but clear enough to register on paper. It was not him. It looked, but it was late. With each movement, with every word, there was a break. And when I realized, it was no longer a reflection. It was something else. Something that wanted to be me. With each line, my heart accelerated. It was not just a matter of intercepted communications or isolation experiments. This document narrated the fragmentation of identity, the duplication of consciousness, a phenomenon that no military manual could never explain. The most terrible was to notice how the soldiers tried to turn the inexplicable into a protocol. The rules were a desperate effort to impose logic on chaos. But the more rules arose, the more impossible it seemed to survive contact with it. There were specific instructions, written as commandments. Never answer the first call. Wait for 3 beats. If they are 4, do not open the door. Do not look at the mirror after midnight. If you hear your own voice, wait 3 seconds before you speak. Never read the complete sequence aloud. These rules were repeated in different parts of the file, as if the authors feared that a single reading were not enough to fix them in the reader's mind. It was a survival manual hidden within a military report. Suddenly, as you reread these instructions, I felt the metallic crack again behind me. 3 beats equal to those described in the document. The sound was real, tangible, vibrating on the concrete walls of the warehouse. I closed the file by instinct, as if it could stop the sequence, but knew it was too late. I was already inside the protocol. I looked at the dirty window reflection at the bottom of the room and saw the shadow. The same delayed silhouette, repeating. My gestures with 2 seconds difference. Only this time, the lag seemed to decrease. When I took a deep breath, the reflection revved almost together. When I raised my hand, he raised her almost at the same moment. It was as if adjusting, correcting the delay to reach the perfect synchrony. Panic consumed me, but at the same time, a strange lucidity took over my mind. It was as if the document's own reading had prepared my brain to recognize each stage of the process. I knew what would come next because it was already written. The reflection would speak, and when I spoke, I would try to convince myself to repeat. I looked back to the pages and found the warning that froze me to the bones. Never repeat the phrase he says. This is how the total duplication happens. The air was heavy, and then the shadow opened its mouth. The sound came out low, distorted, like an old recording reproduced on spent tape. The phrase was short, but devastating. I've been here before. The desire to answer was almost irresistible. It was as if the sentence had been designed to pull out of me automatic confirmation, a human echo that would seal the duplication. I locked my jaw, squeezed my fists, and remained silent. The reflection smiled. I had never seen my own smile seem so fake, so shifted, as if that was no longer my face, but the mask of something that tried to imitate him. The lamps blinked again, and radio squealed with intensity. A code emerged on the display, even without power on. 47B. It was the number of the dossier. The file was interconnected to the experience, as if it were an activation key. There was no doubt. The document was not just a record. It was a trap created to perpetuate the phenomenon. I thought of the soldiers, the names listed as absent. They had probably going through this, facing their own duplicates, lost the battle against the late reflection. And now I was facing the same choice, to follow the rules or give in to the temptation to answer. The document fell from my hands, spreading pages on the floor. Some slid to the corner of the room, revealing a diagram that I had not yet seen. It was a timer, marked with 12 minutes. Below is the instruction. When the count begins, you can't stop. 12 minutes to the point of non-refinement. I looked around, trying to understand. And then I realized the reflection was no longer late. He moved in perfect sync with me. Every breath, every gesture, all mirrored without failure. Timer had started. I was facing what they called total duplication. The pages described this final stage as irreversible. From the moment the duplicate equalized to the original, there was no way to distinguish who was who. The record said that at the end of the count, only one remained, but they never specified which one. I felt the pressure increase, as if the air itself was being sucked into the reflection. The radio broke out in noise, and among the sloops, the same sentence was repeated, in different voices. I've been here before. I've been here before. It was a duplicate choir, voices attached to the echo of past decades, still trying to find a body to live. I looked at the shadow, and for the first time she said something different. I said my name. He said clearly, with the exact intonation of my voice. And then he added, "You already answered." The blood froze in my veins. I had not answered aloud, but perhaps the simple act of thinking about response was enough. The pages warned, never think about what he says. He can hear thoughts, but I only realized too late. The imaginary timer was going, and I knew it was a few minutes left. The lights vibrated, the reflection smiled more and more, and I was no longer sure which of us was the real one. It was at this moment that I realized that I was not alone in that room. Among the shadows of the shelves were other figures, distorted, real estate, waiting. Human silhouettes, some with ancient uniforms, others unrecognizable, as if they were incomplete duplicate fragments. They all watched, waiting for the outcome of my countdown. I swallowed dry, knowing that I could not simply close the file and leave. That was already underway. The hidden truth of the Cold War was not just a nation's dispute, but an experiment that had surpassed the limits of reality. And I was now part of it. If you got here, it means that you have entered me to the heart of this lost Cold War file and survived every detail, recorded on these forbidden pages. This already shows that you are part of the group that is not afraid to face the hidden truth. And so, I want to ask for your help. Subscribe now to the channel so as not to lose the next secret files that we will open together. Also leave your like, because it strengthens our investigation and shows that you want more documents, more confidential reports, and more prohibited stories to surface. And to prove that you went to the end of this video, comment below. The phrase, "I heard the second call, so I will know exactly who the true explorers of this mystery are." And it doesn't come out yet, because the next file is now available to you. Click now on the video that is appearing on the screen, where I reveal what happened when I opened a Forbidden's NASA folder, and what I saw changed everything.